Aliyah Johnson had always considered herself a careful driver. She knew the rules of the road and made sure to follow them, especially in the city where she had lived all her life. That morning, she was running late for work, but she was still mindful of the speed limit as she navigated through the busy streets. It wasn't uncommon for traffic to back up, especially during the morning rush hour, and Aliyah often found herself inching along in the slow-moving lines. As the light ahead turned yellow, she made a split-second decision to slow down rather than rush through it. She wasn't speeding, but she was still cautious, knowing that officers often patrolled around the busy intersections. She hadn't even noticed the police car until it was already behind her, the flashing lights reflecting in her rearview mirror. Aliyah's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what she could have done wrong. She pulled over to the side of the road, her palms suddenly sweaty. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel as the officer approached. "Good morning, ma'am," the officer said, his voice polite but firm. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, with an air of authority that made Aliyah immediately uncomfortable. "Good morning," she replied, trying to keep her tone steady. "Is there a problem, officer?" "You ran a red light back there," he said, pointing towards the intersection she had just passed. "I'm issuing a citation for the violation." Aliyah blinked in confusion. She was certain that the light had turned yellow before she reached it, but she didn't argue. There was no use in making the situation worse. "I'm sorry, officer. I thought it was still yellow. Could you check the cameras or the traffic signals?" The officer stared at her for a moment before nodding. "It's a standard fine. No need to check anything, ma'am. I've seen enough." Aliyah's frustration grew, but she tried to remain composed. She was a woman of color, and she knew all too well how quickly things could escalate when the wrong tone was used or the wrong words spoken. She'd heard enough stories, seen enough headlines, to know that a simple traffic stop could turn into something much more. "Could I at least see the evidence, just to make sure I understand what happened?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he scribbled on his ticket pad before handing her the citation. "You can contest it in court if you feel it's unfair," he said curtly. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Aliyah sitting in stunned silence. As she drove away, the ticket burning a hole in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. She wasn't imagining things. The light had been yellow, not red. She had no idea why the officer seemed so certain about his version of events, but she was determined to get to the bottom of it. If she had to contest the fine in court, then that was what she would do. Little did she know, this seemingly small traffic violation would unravel a chain of events that would expose a hidden web of corruption and change the course of her life forever. Aliyah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the ticket. Her mind kept circling back to the police officer's confident dismissal of her concerns, the way he handed her the citation, as though he had no doubt about her guilt. She had replayed the intersection in her mind 1,000 times, and no matter how she tried to view it, she was sure that the light had been yellow when she went through it. But what if she was wrong? What if she had missed something? It wasn't just about the fine, though. It was the way the officer acted, almost as if he'd been expecting to pull her over. It bothered her, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt like she couldn't just let it go. Aliyah had always been one to stand up for what she believed in, and if she was going to contest this fine, she would do it with every ounce of determination she had. The decision wasn't a difficult one for Aliyah. She had never backed down from a fight, especially when she felt that something wasn't right. She reached out to Marcus Williams, a local attorney she had seen advertised for his work in helping people navigate unfair legal situations. His reputation was solid, and his office wasn't too far from where she lived. When she arrived at his office, Marcus greeted her with a warm handshake and a calm demeanor that immediately put her at ease. Aliyah explained the situation, detailing her version of events and her belief that she hadn't violated the traffic light. Marcus listened carefully, nodding as he took notes. He didn't rush her, didn't interrupt, and that made Aliyah feel like she was being taken seriously. After a few moments of silence, Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. "You're right to question this, Aliyah," he said finally. "It doesn't add up. There's no reason for the officer to be so certain, unless he had an agenda, but we'll need to dig deeper to find out what that might be. I'll help you contest the fine in court." Aliyah was relieved. She hadn't known exactly what to expect when she walked in, but having someone who believed in her side of the story felt like a weight lifted off her shoulders. She could already imagine the courtroom, the lights, the tension, the arguments, but no matter how it played out, she was ready. In the following days, Marcus worked tirelessly to prepare the case. He requested traffic camera footage from the intersection, though Aliyah wasn't sure if the cameras had even been working at the time. He subpoenaed the police officers' records, hoping to find any patterns of behavior that might suggest misconduct. But even as the days passed, Aliyah felt the weight of uncertainty growing heavier. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about standing up for herself in a system that often seemed stacked against people like her. The night before the court hearing, Aliyah barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her life in the city she loved, and the way things sometimes seemed just a little harder because of who she was. But tomorrow, in that courtroom, she was going to face whatever came her way. She had no idea that this small battle would soon become part of something much bigger, something that would put the spotlight on an entire system that had been operating under the radar for far too long. When morning came, Aliyah dressed carefully, pulling on her best suit. She had no idea what the outcome would be, but she was determined to walk into that courtroom with her head held high. What started as a simple traffic fine was now something much more, and Aliyah was ready to uncover the truth. As the days ticked down to Aliyah's court date, her thoughts were consumed by one question: what had really happened during that traffic stop? Despite her confidence in her innocence, a nagging feeling kept tugging at her. The officer's certainty about her violation, the way he handed her the ticket without hesitation. It all seemed too orchestrated. Still, she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Her attorney, Marcus Williams, had assured her that the footage from the traffic cameras would help their case. But when the day of the hearing finally arrived, there was still no word from the city about the camera recordings. Marcus had sent multiple requests, and Aliyah's frustration began to mount. It felt like the system was working against her at every turn. When she entered the courtroom, Aliyah was surprised to find the room buzzing with activity. It wasn't what she had expected for a simple traffic violation case. The judge's gavel banged, signaling the start of proceedings, but there was something different in the air. As the case was called, Aliyah saw reporters sitting in the back of the room, scribbling notes and taking photos. Her heart raced. She hadn't expected this level of attention. "Ms. Johnson, are you ready to proceed?" the judge asked, his voice calm but firm. Aliyah nodded, a mix of nerves and determination settling in. "Yes, Your Honor." Marcus stood beside her, his presence a steadying force. He opened the case with a clear, concise argument. "Your Honor, we contest the fine issued to my client, Ms. Johnson, on the grounds that the evidence supporting the ticket is inconclusive. We request access to the traffic camera footage to verify the officer's claim." The judge glanced at the prosecution, who seemed disinterested. "We are still awaiting confirmation from the city," the prosecutor replied. "But the officer's testimony stands. He is confident that Ms. Johnson violated traffic laws." Aliyah couldn't believe what she was hearing. The officer hadn't even been questioned thoroughly. It was as if the court was taking his word without scrutiny. But before she could say anything, the judge paused, looking over his papers thoughtfully. "I will allow a brief recess," he said, his tone neutral. "Ms. Johnson, Mr. Williams, please hold for a moment while we gather the additional materials." As the room emptied for the recess, Aliyah's anxiety swirled. She couldn't ignore the feeling that something was going on behind the scenes. It wasn't just the missing footage or the rushed nature of the proceedings. It was everything about the officer's actions. It felt like there was more to this case than anyone was telling her. Outside the courtroom, a reporter approached her, microphone in hand. "Ms. Johnson, we've been following your case. What do you think about the police officer's testimony? Are you confident in your defense?" Aaliyah, caught off guard, blinked. She hadn't realized the case had garnered media attention. The camera flashes were unsettling, but there was something almost empowering about the sudden focus. She took a deep breath and turned toward the reporter. "I'm confident I didn't break the law," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But I think the real issue here is whether or not justice is truly being served." The reporter nodded, jotting down her words, and moved on. Aaliyah felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a traffic fine anymore. It was about standing up to what she sensed was a system that was trying to sweep things under the rug. When the recess ended, they returned to the courtroom to face the judge. The stakes were higher now. This wasn't just Aaliyah's battle. Somehow, it had become bigger than that. She didn't know it yet, but this case was about to reveal something far more troubling than an unjust traffic citation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable when the proceedings resumed. Aaliyah sat at the defendant's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Marcus stood beside her. The reporters in the back of the room shifted restlessly, and the sound of their cameras clicking only added to the mounting pressure. Aaliyah had expected her case to be a simple matter, a small traffic fine that would be resolved quickly. But now, it felt like it was about to explode into something much bigger. The judge returned to his seat and banged his gavel. "Court is back in session. Ms. Johnson's case continues." Marcus stood up and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we request that the city provide the traffic camera footage from the intersection in question. This footage is critical to the defense, as we believe it will show that my client was in the right when she passed through the light." The prosecutor, a tall man with sharp features, smirked. "Your Honor, we have no reason to doubt the officer's testimony. He is an experienced officer with years of service. His word should be sufficient." The judge didn't respond immediately, his expression unreadable. Aaliyah could feel her heart beating faster, her palms growing sweaty. It was clear the prosecution wasn't making a genuine effort to investigate the truth. They were just trying to get the case over with, as though it was just another minor infraction to brush under the rug. But Aaliyah wasn't going to let that happen. The judge cleared his throat. "I'm going to allow the footage request, but we will proceed with the testimony in the meantime." Aaliyah sat back, feeling a small sense of relief. The footage might be crucial to her defense, but it was good to know the judge wasn't dismissing her case outright. As the room settled into a hushed silence, the officer who had issued the ticket was called to the stand. Officer Darren Mitchell stepped forward, his uniform crisp and clean, his demeanor rigid and formal. Aaliyah watched him closely. He had been so sure of his actions during the traffic stop, and now she had the opportunity to hear his side of the story. The officer took the oath and sat down, looking directly at the judge. "Officer Mitchell," Marcus began, his voice measured but pointed, "can you tell the court why you issued the citation to Ms. Johnson?" The officer cleared his throat. "I observed Ms. Johnson's vehicle approaching the intersection at street name. The light was red when she entered the intersection, and she proceeded through it. I issued the ticket based on my observations and the traffic laws." "Could you describe the conditions at the time of the incident? Was there anything that might have affected your ability to clearly see the light?" "Not at all," the officer replied. "The conditions were normal, clear weather, no obstructions, and the light was clearly visible." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "So, no potential for a yellow light, perhaps?" The officer's expression remained unchanged. "The light was red when she went through it. That's why I issued the citation." Aaliyah's eyes narrowed as she listened to his calm, rehearsed responses. He sounded certain, but something about his confidence didn't sit right with her. There was no room for doubt in his words, and that felt strange. Marcus continued his questioning. "Did you happen to review any traffic camera footage from the intersection?" The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking toward the prosecutor. "No, I didn't. I rely on my observations and experience. Alia's stomach tightened. The officer hadn't even bothered to check the cameras, even though it would have been the most logical step in confirming his claim. Something about this seemed off, but she couldn't quite place it yet. The judge interrupted, his voice cutting through the tension. We will now take a short break while we retrieve the footage from the city's traffic cameras. Alia glanced at Marcus, who gave her a reassuring nod. For the first time since the trial began, she felt like they might have a chance at getting to the truth. The footage could be the key that unlocked the entire case, and maybe even something much bigger. As the courtroom filed out for the break, Alia's mind raced. Why had the officer been so certain of his version of events? And why had he refused to check the footage? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but she knew the real drama had only just begun. When the courtroom reconvened, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. Alia, still seated at the defendant's table, found herself clenching her fists in anticipation. The judge had ordered the release of the traffic camera footage, but the wait felt like an eternity. As the doors opened, the courtroom fell silent, and a technician wheeled in a large screen, ready to display the footage that might decide her case. Marcus leaned toward Alia and whispered, "This is it. This could be the proof we need." The judge nodded to the technician, who began to play the footage. Alia leaned forward, her eyes glued to the screen. The intersection appeared clearly, empty, save for a few cars, and the traffic light hanging in the air above. The camera angle captured everything, and Alia could see herself approaching the intersection. Her heart raced as the video continued. The light turned yellow just before she crossed the line. It wasn't red. It wasn't even close. She hadn't run the light. The footage clearly showed her slowing down and proceeding through the intersection, just as the light transitioned from yellow to red. Alia's breath caught in her chest. The evidence was irrefutable. The officer's claim was false. She hadn't run the red light. But as the footage played, something else became apparent. Just as Alia's car passed through the intersection, the camera shifted slightly to reveal a police car sitting in a nearby parking lot, its lights off and its engine running, clearly waiting. The officer had been in position long before the light had changed. Alia's stomach dropped. The officer hadn't been responding to a routine traffic situation. He had been waiting. He knew exactly what he was doing when he issued the citation. But why? And why had he been so certain that she had violated the traffic law when the footage showed otherwise? Marcus saw it too. He stood, his voice cutting through the silence. "Your Honor, the footage clearly shows that Ms. Johnson did not violate any traffic laws. The light was yellow, not red, and she proceeded through the intersection lawfully. Furthermore, it appears that the officer was already stationed in the area, potentially waiting for a target." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor's face went pale. He shot a quick glance at the officer, who was now visibly sweating. There was a shift in the room, a palpable change from the earlier certainty that Alia would lose this case. Now all eyes were on Officer Darren Mitchell. His confidence was starting to crack. The judge turned to the officer. "Is there anything you would like to add, Officer Mitchell?" For a moment, the officer didn't speak. He seemed caught, his eyes darting between the judge, the prosecutor, and Marcus. Then, in a low voice, he replied, I didn't see the footage. I relied on my observations." Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. "And what exactly were those observations, officer? You didn't check the cameras, didn't question your assumption. Why not? Why were you so certain that Ms. Johnson broke the law when the evidence shows otherwise?" The officer's face reddened. His hands clenched into fists. I made a mistake," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "But it wasn't intentional." The crowd shifted uneasily. Alia couldn't believe what she was hearing. The officer was backing down, but his actions had already set things in motion. It wasn't just about a ticket anymore. There was something deeper at play, something larger than this individual stop. The officer's mistake was a small piece of a much bigger puzzle. Before Marcus could respond, A new voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. A reporter stood, holding a notepad in one hand and a microphone in the other. "We've learned that Officer Mitchell was recently involved in a controversial case involving political pressure to issue fines in certain neighborhoods. Could this be related to your actions today?" Alia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't heard anything about this. What did it mean? Was there a connection between the officer's actions and the city's higher-ups? The prosecutor's face went white. The room fell into an eerie silence as the judge banged his gavel. "Enough," the judge said. "We will adjourn for the day and reconvene tomorrow. I expect a full investigation into these claims." As the courtroom began to empty, Alia could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The fine was no longer the issue. Something much larger, something tied to the city's leadership, was starting to unravel, and Alia had just stumbled into the center of it. The day after the court session, Alia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The camera footage had cleared her name, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. The officer's sudden mistakes and strange behavior, combined with the murmurs from the media about political pressure, hinted at something much deeper than a mere traffic violation. It felt like she had unwittingly stumbled into a much bigger story. Marcus was already deep into his research, his phone ringing off the hook with reporters and sources reaching out. Alia, feeling a strange sense of urgency, decided to take matters into her own hands. There had to be more than the simple case of an officer making an error in judgment. Later that afternoon, she received a call that made her stomach twist. It was Detective Carla Moore, the lead investigator, calling to confirm her suspicions. The detective had been able to dig deeper into the officer's background and had uncovered troubling connections. "Alia," Carla's voice came through the phone, her tone cautious. "I've been able to look into Officer Mitchell's recent activities. He's been involved in several incidents of overzealous ticketing, what looked like random minor violations, but what I found is even worse than that. There's a pattern that seems to connect his actions to certain parts of the city, and it's not just about traffic enforcement." Alia felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean? What kind of pattern?" "Well, it turns out that these areas where Mitchell was focusing his efforts, especially the predominantly black neighborhoods, are the same areas that have been targeted by the city's political leaders for certain redevelopment projects that generate significant revenue. There's a possibility that Mitchell was pressured to keep people in these areas fearful and compliant, generating fines as a source of income." Alia's mind raced. "You're saying he was part of a larger scheme to collect fines as part of a gentrification effort?" "It's starting to look that way," Carla replied grimly. "And I'm afraid it goes higher than just him. We've uncovered some documents suggesting that certain city officials were aware of the pressure being placed on Mitchell and other officers. They may have even given him a green light to target specific neighborhoods." Alia's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about corruption in the police department. It was a coordinated effort between law enforcement and powerful city officials to exploit the very people they were supposed to protect. It was all part of a larger, darker plan to profit from the struggles of the community. "We need to stop this," Alia said, her voice firm. "What can we do? How can we get this information out there?" "Right now, we need to be cautious," Carla warned. "I'm gathering more evidence, but it's still risky. If we move too fast, we might tip off the wrong people. But there's no doubt in my mind that Mitchell was part of something much bigger, and we can't let it continue." Alia's resolve hardened. She had already been fighting for justice for herself, but now the stakes were higher. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the entire community, the people who had been systematically oppressed and targeted. She couldn't back down now. "I won't," Alia said quietly. "We can't back down. Let's make sure we get this right." As the investigation into the corruption began to unfold, it was clear that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But Alia knew that the truth had to come out. She was no longer just a defendant in a courtroom. She had become an advocate for justice, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. With the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, Alia steeled herself for the battle ahead. She wasn't just fighting to clear her name anymore. She was fighting to expose a system that had been built on the backs of the vulnerable. And she wasn't going to stop until it was dismantled. The next morning, the courtroom was filled with more tension than Alia had ever felt. The judge had ordered a full investigation into the officer's conduct and the possible political pressure surrounding his actions. The media had caught wind of the story, and reporters filled the back of the room, eager to learn more about the officer's potential involvement in a larger scandal. Alia felt the weight of the eyes on her, but she knew this battle was far from over. The prosecutor, still reeling from the previous day's revelations, seemed unusually hesitant. He had been forced to go on the defensive, trying to explain the officer's actions and distance the city from any wrongdoing. But Alia could see that he was struggling, as though he knew something far deeper was at play but couldn't admit it. When the proceedings began, the judge took his seat, his face stern. "I've been briefed on the findings of the investigation into Officer Mitchell's conduct," he began, his voice carrying through the room. "The allegations raised by the defense are serious, and they require immediate attention. This court will now hear from the investigative team." Alia could feel her heartbeat quicken as the lead investigator, Detective Carla Moore, approached the stand. She was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority. The detective took an oath and sat down, ready to present the results of her team's investigation. "Detective Moore," the judge began, "what did your investigation uncover regarding Officer Mitchell's actions?" Detective Moore's voice was clear and steady. "Our investigation found that Officer Mitchell had been involved in several instances where officers in his precinct were pressured to issue fines in certain neighborhoods, regardless of the legitimacy of the traffic violations. We also found that there was an unspoken agreement to target specific individuals in the area, often those who were seen as more likely to challenge the system." Alia's stomach twisted as the detective continued. Further investigation revealed that these actions were not isolated, but part of a broader pattern, one that tied into political influence. Several city officials were aware of these practices, if not actively encouraging them, to generate revenue through traffic fines. The room went silent. Alia could hardly believe what she was hearing. It was one thing to know that systemic corruption existed. It was another to have it laid out in front of her so plainly. The implications were enormous. This wasn't just about one officer making a mistake or overstepping his bounds. It was about an entire system rigged to profit from the very citizens it was supposed to protect. Marcus, standing beside her, turned slightly to give Alia an encouraging nod. He had known for some time that this case was bigger than just a wrongful fine, but even he seemed surprised by the depth of the corruption that was now being revealed. The detective continued, presenting a series of documents that traced the financial benefits of the fines, showing how certain neighborhoods, particularly those with higher populations of people of color, were targeted more than others. It was clear that certain political figures had used their influence to direct the police force's efforts toward these areas, effectively turning traffic violations into a tool for exploitation. As the detective finished her statement, the room was filled with murmurs. The judge cleared his throat, raising his hand for silence. "This is a grave matter," he said. "It is clear that Officer Mitchell's actions were part of a larger pattern of abuse. But we must also address the role of those in power who allowed this to continue." Alia couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. The truth was finally coming to light. She had no idea where this would all lead, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't back down now. The fight was no longer just about her. It was about exposing a corrupt system that had been exploiting vulnerable people for far too long. The judge turned his gaze to the prosecutor, his tone unforgiving. "I suggest you take a long, hard look at the evidence and prepare for the next steps. This case is far from finished." As the courtroom emptied for another recess, Alia walked out with Marcus by her side, both of them silent for a moment, taking in the enormity of what had just been revealed. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, Alia felt like the scales were beginning to tip in her favor. The days following the court's recess were filled with a whirlwind of activity. The investigation into the systemic corruption that had plagued the city was no longer just a side note in Alia's case. It had become the story. Reporters clamored for interviews, and political figures began to distance themselves from the allegations. As the public learned more about the details of the scandal, the pressure mounted on the city's leadership to take action. Alia knew that what had started as a simple traffic ticket was now a fight for something far greater: justice for an entire community. When the trial reconvened, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. The judge, who had previously been neutral, now seemed more resolute, almost as if he understood the gravity of the situation. The room was quieter, more focused. Officer Mitchell, who had once seemed so confident, now sat with his head down, looking like a man who knew his time was up. The prosecutor, who had been attempting to defend the city's actions, had shifted tactics. He no longer contested the claims of corruption. He couldn't. Instead, he focused on minimizing the damage, attempting to downplay the role of the city's leadership in the scandal. But it was too late. The evidence was too strong, and the public outcry too loud. Marcus stood up, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, the case before us is not simply about one officer's failure to follow protocol. This is about a system that has been rigged for years, a system that exploits vulnerable communities for financial gain. The evidence presented to this court shows that Officer Mitchell's actions were part of a broader systemic issue, one that has been allowed to persist by those in power." Alia sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, feeling both exhausted and empowered. The weight of the fight had taken its toll on her, but it had also given her strength. She had not only fought for her own justice, but had become a symbol for the many others who had been wronged by a corrupt system. The judge looked down at the documents in front of him, then up at the prosecutor, his gaze hardening. It is clear that there has been a gross miscarriage of justice, both in the handling of Ms. Johnson's case and in the systemic corruption that has been revealed. Officer Mitchell will face charges for his actions, and I will be requesting a full review of the police department's practices moving forward. Alia's heart pounded in her chest. The officer had been taken down, but the fight wasn't over. The city leaders who had allowed this system to flourish still had to be held accountable. But the judge's words were a start. They were the first step toward dismantling the corruption that had poisoned the city for far too long. As the trial came to a close, the judge ruled in Alia's favor. The fine was dismissed, and the charges against her were dropped. But that wasn't the most important part of the decision. The judge had ordered a full investigation into the city's law enforcement practices, and it was clear that this case would have far-reaching consequences. Alia stood up, her legs shaking, but her resolve as strong as ever. She walked out of the courtroom with Marcus by her side, a quiet sense of triumph filling her. The battle wasn't over, but she had won this fight. And in the process, she had uncovered a story that would change the city forever. Outside, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the streets. Alia breathed in deeply, knowing that this moment was just the beginning. The corruption had been exposed, but the work to change the system was just beginning. She had taken a stand, and now others would follow her lead.